Thanks for coming over here. Oh, my mic's too high. Hold on. Hopefully now you can hear me. That's better, right? I'm Stephanie Hankey, the co-founder of Tactical Tech. And as you just heard, I'm going to talk today about a project that I worked on and was presented at the Venice Architectural Biennale last year, and I haven't talked about before. So let's see how this goes. So Synthetic Landscapes, this is a two-part story. So Synthetic Landscapes is the exhibition that we showed at the Architecture Biennale, working with two friends and colleagues, Jordan Weber, who's an environmental justice artist from the US, and Michael Wemedemo from Nigeria. And I'm just going to dive straight in and show you something from that. What you're looking at here, it should have sound as well, let's hope. Does the video have sound? Thanks. So what you're looking at here are images from the piece. There's a soundscape and there are videos as well. So when somebody's talking, I'll maybe be quiet so you can hear them. But the soundscape has a combination of sound taken from the two locations that the artist piece is about, which is looking at extractive landscapes in the Niger Delta in Nigeria and oil extraction, and looking at extraction of data from the land and of materials from the land in the Midwest of the US, in Iowa. So these are the two locations. And the images you're looking at are from those two spaces, and they are AI generated. They're images that AI generated and then animated. This was made...
Farmers have been encouraged to take whatever they can out of the soil and really think about agriculture on a large scale. That leads to the way that the people and land were exploited.
So the images, unfortunately, on this projection, they're kind of washed out, but they're much more intense in color when you see them on the screen. But they're basically, we experimented with using AI-generated technologies to create the images in places where you can't film, where it's kind of illegal to film in those places very often, or where it's very difficult to film the devastation on the landscape. So in this sense, we use the technologies to try to create these and to animate these synthetic landscapes.
It has what we call volatile organic compound that volatilizes with time. And when it volatilizes, it mixes up with the air. And nobody has control over the air circulation. So with this kind of proximity to school, certainly you are exposing the kids to inhalation of free radicals from crude oil.
So what you see and what you hear here is stories of the impact of the extraction from the landscape, not only on the land itself, but also on the communities. I'm going to cut the audio now so you can hear me better. It's looking at two spaces, and this is the installation that we showed. So the video you just saw, which I'm sorry, the quality is not great, are those two projections at the back, and then there was a large projection on the ceiling, which is looking at the kinds of data processed and data-assisted images that are taken from those landscapes. And they were kind of large-scale projections, some of them from satellite and remote sensing, and some of them from data analysis of the land. So the two sites, Niger Delta, we looked at Port Harcourt. Niger Delta is the sort of oil extraction capital of the world, actually, not just in Africa. And looking at the way in which the extraction changes the shape of the landscape as well. In the Niger Delta, there are these kind of dendritic, kind of vein-like or leaf-like shapes on the landscape, creating kind of, changing the landscape. And in here you see the kind of artisanal oil extraction. So not only the very big companies that you probably know, Shell and Exxon and others extracting oil, but also small-scale extractions on the landscape. And the way that oil and the spills and leakages from that oil seep into the river systems and the mangrove systems. And within the work, we had like a large-scale infographic on each landscape explaining these three different aspects. If you can kind of read this down in columns. The first one about the extraction from the landscape, the second about the consumption, in this case of the oil, and the third one about the impact on the ground, in particular the leaks and oil spills that happen in that space. And this is just a little abstract from that larger infographic, maybe one small story from there about the consumption of the way that these lines you can see at the bottom here, of the way that the oil moves from the Niger Delta, how it's shipped to Europe, largely, not only, processed, and then how the lower quality oil is extracted and then sent back to Nigeria for use there, whereas the higher quality oil is used in Europe. In the Midwest, we kind of contrasted that with the geometric landscape of the way that the agricultural spaces look from above, unlike the dendritic one you saw earlier. And the way in which that landscape is completely transformed, mostly by crops, creating these kind of unusual landscapes. And you can see in some of the AI-generated images and then animations that we did, or maybe you can slightly see it better if they lower the lights, you can see that there's a way in which these landscapes look kind of uncanny. They're not quite real. It's not possible to have these kind of structures on the landscape. And again, a kind of like large-scale infographic, in this case on Iowa in the Midwest, showing, again, the extraction, consumption, and ground, but this time of large-scale crops. Again, some kind of abstracts from that you can see, which is the ways in which the prairie and the wetlands in the Midwest of the US have been reduced. At the bottom, you see this green space as what used to be the prairie land in the US. And now it used to be about 80%, now it's 0.1% of the landscape. So it's one of the most altered landscapes on Earth. And then the higher up infographics you see there are showing the amount of that landscape that's taken up with crops. And the very top one is showing the amount that's taken up specifically with corn. So about 60% of that land is used to grow field corn. Field corn is not something you can eat. It's something that you use in this process for other things like ethanol, but also used for feed for animals that then humans then eat. So a large majority of that corn that you saw on that landscape of Iowa is being used to feed animals that are then consumed by humans. In that, we kind of looked as well at industrial farming and the way in which animals are kept in thousands of what are called confined animal feeding operation centers, which are kind of like factory farming, as it's more commonly known, of which we don't know how many there are. So the only way, it's illegal to film in these places, and the only way we know how many factory farms there are is by investigations through satellite imagery that shows that there are well over 3,500 of them in the Midwest, and these animal feeding facilities are usually feeding between 1,000 and 24,000 animals. So that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. So that was the larger piece. That's what the animal feeding centers look like. So that's the larger piece at the Venice Architectural Biennale we showed. I'll come back to it at the very end. But within that were these kind of sub-stories of things that I have been looking into for a few years and things I've been following for a long time. And within that, I've been looking at the way in which technology is used for industrial agriculture and how AI and data is being used in that context. So here you're going to hear kind of a series of vignettes, which are these kind of backstories that went into that piece that you saw about the ways in which technology is being used in the agriculture sector and what's happening, with a particular view on value and the question of ownership of data. So there are three kind of vignettes here. So one is around unmarked fields, and there's a series of kind of strange stories that I've been following. The first one is these are all based in Iowa in the Midwest. So the first one took place some years ago where a farmer was kind of driving through the area where he lives, saw a hire car by the side of the road with somebody sitting in it and somebody else digging in the field and thought it was kind of suspicious. So he kind of took down the license plate of the hire car, gave it to Pioneer DuPont, who owned the farming space, and that's a seed company that develops genetically modified seeds, and kind of moved on. And then somehow, sometime later, that's Pioneer, the company I mentioned, something similar happened near the Monsanto growing fields, and the growing and test fields that Monsanto have are there to experiment with new kinds of corn, in particular things like inbred corn. Inbred corn is created to create different kinds of seeds that can withstand drought or pests, those kinds of things. And these are unmarked fields, which often the farmers don't even know what's being grown in the fields. And they saw the same thing and reported it also to the FBI. These are images of the spaces. And sometime later, after several years of being, I think it was 2 or 3 years of being followed by the FBI, they were surveilling a group of 6 people who they considered to be from China working for seed companies who had been collecting seeds throughout that time. And finally, they arrested some of them as they were trying to leave, or they tried to detain some of them as they tried to leave the country, as they looked into the question of what was in their bags. And when they opened the bags, what they found was 2 bags, one with 2 large boxes of popcorn with 374 manila seed envelopes in them, all collected, the seeds that they collected throughout the time, and the other bag with lots of Subway napkins with single seeds in it. And then after that, they brought a case against one of the people, and that person was charged and went to prison. It's kind of a bizarre story. Actually, when you know more about the story, it gets more and more strange, with including kilos of seeds being stopped in Chicago that were then replaced by the FBI, sent back to China with Chinese seeds. These are kind of very strange stories that developed over time, but the estimated value of these seeds is somewhere between 30 and 40 million in IP. A few years later, different story. Somebody who was working at a company called Climate Corp was arrested leaving the airport, also by the FBI, for this time stealing an algorithm. The report said this is the algorithm. The algorithm was designed to monitor nutrient content value in soil. And the algorithm he had was on a SD card and on his laptop as he sort of boarded the plane, and then again was sentenced to, was sentenced to or charged with 15 years in prison and over $5 million in fines. So why were these algorithms so important? One of the things that is happening in the sector working on technology around agriculture and food is a kind of hyper data collection way of thinking about industrial landscapes. So, for example, how individual trees are counted or monitored, how they grow, how facial recognition technologies are kind of used on plants, which is kind of like a plant-by-plant care. It's very similar to the kind of quantified life or facial recognition technologies that we're used to, maybe more in humans. And then those are being kind of developed not only at the individual level, but also at the field level. This is a company called OneSoil, who is using technology to enable people to understand not only how these are really beautiful images, but they also show not only which crops are grown where, but also what their value is. And these are kinds of technologies that are not only useful to farmers, but also to investors and to insurance companies, with a focus very often on thinking about the management of these assets in the context of climate change. This is what you can do with some of those technologies when you start to scale them up away from that kind of individual plant to the large scale, and you start to think about what they can do and be used for, and how, in this case, you can see the growing season in the US, how that looks from super zoomed out. And the next one I'm going to show you is you're going to see what it looks like when you look at the sequence of the way in which it looks like when you've seeded, planted, and harvested the harvest in Ukraine. In this case, you'll see it right now. And what that starts to give you is a very different sense of how data can be valuable at scale. So not just the individual plant recognition that you saw early on, but also what happens when you start to monitor that over time. That was a time-lapse sequence of what that looks like. This is something publicly available on OneSoil's website. I did inquire about getting a more up-to-date version of this, because this was, I think, 2020, this data. But since the conflict in Ukraine, it's not possible to get that information, and that information is usually quite out of people's reach. So it's about $20,000 I was quoted to try and get that kind of info and simulation of crops in Ukraine at this point. But it gives you a sense of kind of how the industry is. And the last part of this kind of sequence of stories is about biosurveillance capitalism. I'm using that term because of the term surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, where we're used to thinking about that term in the context of collection of data on humans. And I think it's an important term to use because there's a very specific dynamic that it's referring to, which is where data is collected, which is useful for an individual, but at scale kind of is then used to collect insights and to monetize that data in a different way. So going back to the story about the algorithm that was stolen, who was that from? That was from a company called the Climate Corporation. And the Climate Corporation was a company started by ex-Google employees who were interested in figuring out if they could, make a business that essentially used data on weather at a micro level to sell insurance. And they started out that way, but turned out that and then in 2010, they focused specifically on agriculture, realizing that what they'd actually created was not necessarily a great platform for insurance, but a really good platform for figuring out microclimates and weather on a really small scale. What then happened was Monsanto bought Climate Corp for $1.1 billion in 2013. So Climate Corp, this technology became part of Monsanto. And then Bayer bought Monsanto for $66 billion. So Climate Corp became part of Bayer. So that move brought seed scripting, predictive farming, and agrochemical under one roof, under one company. I'm going to explain just something very simple in case you don't have the context for what's been happening in the agrochemical industry, and I think it's relevant in this context, is during that time there was a series of other acquisitions that took place, which changed the landscape of how the biggest agrochemical companies in the world work, and therefore the relationship with data. So Bayer, as I said, bought Monsanto. Monsanto had bought Climate Corp, and the name changed to Climate Field View, so that's what it's called currently. At that time, Bayer bought Monsanto, all around the same few years. ChemChina bought Syngenta, and Dow and DuPont merged, and BASF stayed the same. So what that meant was that the 7 biggest agrochemical companies in the world became 4, which control 67% of the world's seeds and nearly 75% of the world's fertilizers and pesticides. The numbers always vary slightly on the percentages, but it's around that. It's around about 70% control of the world's seeds and agrochemicals that we rely on, obviously, for our food safety. Thanks. So Climate Field View is a part of that ecosystem. And let's talk about what it gives the farmers for a second. What it gives the farmers is in their hand data on what's happening in their fields. And there's the farmer kind of like his own personal panopticon on his iPad. And the adverts often say that farmers can now monitor individual plants in the field from their offices. But here he is out in the field. And this is the kind of data it's extracting. It's soil health, weather patterns, other elements which are important. Seed type, seeding, plant growth, plant health, and plant yield. So that means like very, very detailed information. And the farmer who's going out in the field with his tractor is collecting that data on a regular basis. And that data is being used to help him understand, or her understand, what's happening in his fields, but also it's being collected centrally. This data is so accurate. Here's a piece from the New Yorker from 2013 that says, using data from the system, the Climate Corporation creates moisture and precipitation maps so precise that in some cases a farmer can determine whether the field on one side of a road is wetter than the field on the other side of the road. So that's how detailed it is for the farmer. And they're collecting billions of data points. And that technology is now used on 60 million hectares of land worldwide and across 23 countries. So this is a little bit taken from the privacy policy of Climate Field View. This is from 2022, saying we use field view data to help improve the effectiveness of Bayer Crop Sciences seed and crop protection portfolio of products. So that means that the data that's being collected from the individual farmers is also being aggregated across all these farmlands. And this is 2 more parts from the privacy policy. One is that biometric information, for example, iris, retina, fingerprint, face, hand, palm, and vein patterns, and you can read the rest. Gait patterns, which is the way you walk, or rhythms, and sleep, health, or exercise data are collected on the farmers. And then inferences are made from that, such as psychological trends, predispositions, behavior, intelligence, attitudes, and aptitudes. I should say that I checked yesterday their privacy policy and they've changed it. but this is from 2022. So until last year, year before last, this is how it was. But they've now taken out the fact that they collect biometric information. I'm guessing somebody read it and thought it didn't look great. So yeah, that's how it does. So what does it do for the farmer? The farmer gets very, very detailed information on what are modified seeds in highly medicated soil that they have to keep alive. And on the other hand, and also reality, right? I mean, the combination of extreme weather events and climate change means this is extremely difficult to keep going. So it's very important that they then start to kind of quantify their farming, and it has to modernize as an industry. So there's a very legitimate reason for farmers to start using predictive farming and smart farming. And at the same time, what the company gets is not only the clients and the ability to serve them, but also the aggregate data. And what's not clear and what's not public is what they do with this data, aside from information that you can find on the fact that it's informing their products. So you have insights, the most detailed insights on meter-by-meter level of farms in 23 countries being held centrally by one of the biggest agrochemical companies in the world. So, yeah, returning to where we started on synthetic landscapes. These are images from the ceiling in that Venice Architectural Biennale I showed at the beginning. These images are inspired by, and originally taken from, and then inspired by, and then with AI generated, to look at the ways in which these imaging technologies show up in these contexts. Some of them are very aesthetically beautiful, they're kind of mesmerizing, and others are kind of surprising. And the way we use AI is merging often the kind of the realities of these two different landscapes, and at some point they come together, and it's not really clear if you're looking at a field or a leaf or one space or the other, which is the Midwest and Niger Delta, because they're both heavily extractive landscapes. So they're kind of amazing in terms of our mastery of the use of technology now to understand these landscapes from the sky very often, and not only, but also through machine learning and other kinds of technology like you saw, like facial recognition technology. And we need these technologies to some extent because we're so heavily dependent on these industrial scale agricultural methods, and especially in the context of climate change, where things are changing so rapidly that it's very hard, and for food security it's very important that we're able to monitor and set expectations about what to expect. And they're also obviously heavily used by the investment insurance industries. Yet, at the same time, I think we're only beginning to ask questions about its true value. So back to the stories we looked at, the question of the IP, the question of the sort of geopolitics between, in this case, between China and the US, of food security and of intelligence on growing the main crops that we need and that are also traded on the international commodities market and the futures market. And at the same time, we don't really understand the value of the technologies and who's holding the data centrally. So for us, it's for the work I've been doing, it's the very beginning of these questions about who should have access to this data, who gains the insights from it on that kind of scale in the context in which we all know the landscape's changing and the resources that we rely on are changing to grow the food that we need. And at the same time, the question of how these unique insights are being held by privately held companies, not necessarily in the context of public interest, meaning we don't have access to that, we can't use it outside of those companies, and there are not yet alternatives that have scaled in any way that can help us learn about what's happening to the landscape that we rely on. That's it. Thank you. We have it's a lot of information very quickly, but we do still have a few minutes if anybody has a question. I'd be happy to talk more about it or comment. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, how does Field View collect this data from the field? I mean, what are the signals and how do you receive them?
So there are different ways, but they're usually attached to the technology that they're using. So, for example, There was a collaboration as well proposed between John Deere, for example, and Climate Corp. So very often they'll be on the tractors or on the machines that they're using in the fields. And then other times they'll be collecting data from satellites. So it's normally a combination of what they call, well, ground truth data, they call it, which is data collected from the fields, and predictive data, which is, the normal weather patterns and those kinds of areas, and maybe data over the last 10 to 15 years. And then at the same time, data which is live data, like, for example, dynamic data from satellites. In that sense, it's quite a typical training model set of data that AI often uses, or machine learning often uses. Yeah, but it's the fact that the farmers are using, they can't have that level of information without the farmers as well, because you would only have the ambient data in a way, or the live data. You wouldn't have the ground truth data, the field data. Yeah.
Hello. Oh, hi. Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if in your research, if you've come across any open data sets or non-profit predictive farming initiatives that are trying to do any similar work on a smaller scale, locally or internationally?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So there's smaller companies doing predictive farming and smart farming, and then there are. I've read quite a bit of academic research as well on. So, for example, there was a student at MIT that kind of looked deep into how the data is being used and processed. So there is that's not open data, but there are analysis of what data they're collecting. But a lot of it's assumed. It's quite hard they don't make it public, for example. And then the smaller companies that are doing it are more open about the practices, but a lot of them have to find ways to monetize it. So then, as I mentioned, OneSoil, they're quite a small company, but they have to charge a lot of money to give people access. So even in the cases where I would say they're not by mega corporations, they tend to be less accessible for example, people like us. Yeah. Although I would say that there's more innovation now in personal access to satellites. So there are places opening up which weren't there even just 2 years ago. Yeah. Okay, thanks so much. Have a good day.